I'll make a start, and I'll make a start by saying good afternoon and welcome to another session in our Gen AI seminar series. And today's speaker is our friend and colleague, Professor Lawrie Phipps. So Lawrie is visiting professor of digital leadership at the University of Chester, senior research lead at GISC, which is an organization I would encourage colleagues to look into if you're not familiar with it. And most importantly, perhaps, Lawrie is also Senior Research Fellow here at MTU. His recent project, RefAI, was a high-profile and maybe even controversial initiative examining how generative AI is influencing research, assessment, evidence production, and research culture generally in the UK. His own ongoing research focuses on academic behaviors and institutional responses to generative AI. And he and I and we in general are joined by Dr. Donna Lanklow. So Donna is a well-known US-based digital learning and digital practices scholar who's worked with us in MTU a lot over the years and has teamed up with Lawrie on a number of projects and initiatives, including the Ref AI one that I just mentioned there. So Donna is going to play the role today of official question asker and conversation wrangler, mischief maker. Let's find out. But that brings me on to say that this is a different format to our usual one. In place of a presentation, we are going to have a conversation. So we'll have a conversation for like 40 to 45 minutes with a bit left over then for questions from the audience. As usual, those of you not attending live, as in those of you just watching the recording, will only get the initial bit. Colleagues attending live, you can pose questions to the Q&A area in Zoom, and you can upvote but not downvote the questions of others. Donna and Lawrie, look, I know you're doing loads together and apart, so thanks so much for accepting my invitation to do this. Okay, over to you. Let's get going.
You're welcome. I find it very hard to say no to fun invitations, so thank you, Garode. Lawrie, would you like to set the scene on what we've been doing and what you've been doing? You and I started off doing work on practices in generative AI off the back of work we had been doing around practices during the pandemic emergency. As soon as we were talking less about the pandemic emergency, all of a sudden we had to start talking about generative AI. So maybe give a little background on what we've been up to.
So you and I have worked, since the onset of generative AI, we started working with colleagues at the University of Bristol, Richard Watermeyer, Rodolfo Benitez, and also Tom Crick. And we've done a lot of work around students and their use of AI. We did some really good work around staff, I think, around what their behaviors were. And we started looking at how these tools are already starting to become embedded in academic practice in a whole range of different things. I think one of the things that, and I'm going to talk about this probably a little bit more throughout this conversation, is that one of the things that's happening is that technology and that use of the tools has got a tendency to run ahead of policy, and in some cases ahead of even institutional honesty about what's going on. And then I started working with Richard specifically to extend that. In the UK, we have a research excellence framework, which is how we measure and look at research quality across all research institutions. Most institutions are involved in research. This is a data-intensive, high-stakes governance mechanism. It allocates funding, it shapes reputation, influences institutional strategy. So we were approached and spoke to Research England, which is the big funder, and they said, we really need to know what the impact is. And that's where this project, the RefAI project, came from. So we spoke with institutions across the whole of the UK about how generative AI is being used in assessing the quality of research. And we found nothing too dramatic. It was patchy. There was lots of uneven experimentation. We found some institutions were building internal tools. Others are avoiding the conversation altogether. Professional services staff were quite often a lot more pragmatic than academics. But we found AI literacy was generally low and that trust in these systems was generally fragile. I think, I think overall we found, and I'm thinking purely in terms of research, the things that we heard most were that most people insisted, and this is attention, most people insisted that human peer review must remain central to research assessment. But at the same time, those same people were telling us that they assumed that the people that were judging research and that were writing up submissions for these things will all be using AI by the time of the next research excellence framework, which is in 2029. So that contradiction isn't trivial. And it raises questions about transparency, about competitive advantage and trust. And I guess, I mean, for Ireland and for higher education more broadly, the question is not whether AI will shape research assessment, curriculum design, or even institutional reporting on a range of other things. I think it already is. So the real question is whether we shape its integration deliberately and equitably and transparently, or whether we just allow this uneven adoption to quietly distort the system. But it's not a technological conversation. It's a
Right.
governance and culture conversation.
And I think, Lawrie, I think that one of the themes that goes across the work that we did with academics specifically, and then the work that you're doing with the research framework is, as you said, that tension between people saying, well, I really want human factors, but also I assume it's going to surround us.
Yes.
But also the tension between people being sort of left on their own to figure things out and institutional expectations that things will be figured out in the
Yeah.
absence of institutional guidance, institutional frameworks. There was a real desire for somebody other than the individual struggling with this to make decisions about things. And actually, I'm curious at this point, Garode, how is what we're describing different or the same with the landscape that's happening? And I'm thinking particularly, I know the HEA has come out with statements and reports. So how does that jive with what you're witnessing?
Well, I suppose I'm not as up to date or qualified to speak in terms of the research side of things, but as you say, and similar things come up in this area anyway, but in the area of teaching and learning. But as you say, HEA have published a number of documents. They published a policy framework on GenAI in higher education in December. It was much anticipated, much needed, and generally very well received. I would say. I think Lawrie, you've seen it.
I think it's really good.
Yeah, I think it finds a kind of a middle way really between kind of uncritical boosting or uncritical adoption and uncritical rejection, if you like, or uninformed outright rejection of things. It's very much value based. A lot of those values relate to some of the things you've already said there, Lawrie. So it does the usual stuff in terms of, as it needs to, in terms of academic integrity and AI literacy, but there's lots of stuff in there around transparency and equity and access and sustainability in all senses of the word. And it was written by a man from Cork, so
So it must be good.
the quality shines through. Like what can I say? There's a few other things maybe worth mentioning just to give people their credit. So QQI is our quality and qualifications authority. They, through NAIN, which is the National Academic Integrity Network, have published quite a bit on the academic integrity side of things. So academic integrity, quality assurance in a kind of AI world. And there's also an advisory council, I think it's called, that provides guidance on AI across lots of different sectors, including education. So lots of stuff out there, I suppose, and then obviously there's the other stuff that we'd all be aware of in terms of international bodies like UNESCO and the OECD and so on. But from what you've said already, Lawrie, while I'd be more familiar with the teaching and learning side of things, it seems like very much the same kind of themes coming up there in terms of governance, equity, transparency.
I think it's true.
And I think there are also issues around control. So there's already a question in the Q&A about sort of what to do with cybersecurity when we've got these systems that are not university systems being embedded in university systems. We've already seen lapses in security protocols because of these tools being put into other tools and leaving backdoors and things. I think that is related to a question that I persistently have about these GAI tools and the discourse around them. There are a lot of different sets of voices in these conversations. And so I wonder, Lawrie, if you could talk a little bit about whose voices are dominating the discussions that you witness, and what do you think is their sort of differing impact of those voices? There's a power and influence analysis here that I think is worth trying to get into a little bit.
Sure. Okay.
Easy question.
I think first of all, the most dominant voice is the actual technology companies themselves, and it's not like it was, 30 years ago when, you and myself and Garode started in this. Those voices are now, they're everywhere. And they're available throughout all the social media, and you see the news about those technology companies. So they're not isolated voices that are only speaking to a very narrow audience. Those big technology companies are speaking to the world, and the world is paying attention to what they're saying. So they've become very dominant. And I think much of the early narrative about the tools in education and research was framed through product announcements. This is the new thing, or demonstrations, and also claims about efficiency, promises around personalization and transformation. So we saw a lot of that as a dominant voice and a dominant tone of voice as well. And of course, the other thing that came through very strongly was the companies told us that these tools were inevitable. So that was very much the tone. A lot of that discussion then set the tone of the conversation, and because of that framing, I think institutions found themselves reacting to the roadmaps of those tools, and those tools have been produced outside the sector, but we had to respond to those tools that were happening rather than starting from our own educational priorities. So I think that was the very first dominant voices. In my experience in the UK, we then also see government, we see institutional leaders and policy organizations increasingly getting involved in the discussion. And rightly, some of that focus has been on things like risk management, governance, institutional reputation. At the same time, a lot of the commentary was about global leadership. It was about government saying, well, we're going to be the world leaders in this, and this is going to drive growth. And if you look at the policies in the UK, for example, we have a modern industrial strategy, and it cross-references various other strategies around AI in education and AI in skills. And our recent education white paper also talks about those things and about linking it to growth. And so we see AI from government sort of through the whole narrative now. So that's interesting. And that forces institutional leadership to pay attention to that. And so we see the conversations going around things like opportunity or competitiveness. And that creates pressure then for rapid adoption, because we have to get ahead of the game. And sometimes that happens before we have a strong evidence base.
So, Lawrie,
I think the final voice I want to talk about is because I'm there and I look a lot. I've got to be honest, it doesn't matter where those voices come from, But if you look at LinkedIn, it feels like 80% of the posts from my feed are either about AI, written with AI, or contains an AI generated image. So, there's a whole sort of, we've got the sort of the top, the technology companies, we've got government, we've got institutional leaders, but we can't ignore the fact that we're generating the hype ourselves as well.
So you talked about the people who are selling the tools. You talked about efficiencies. You talked about political impetus for question mark growth, or,
Okay.
some
Yeah.
sort of thing. We work in university contexts. You haven't talked about teaching, learning, pedagogy. It seems to me that a lot of the churning discourse around AI doesn't get to the part where the people who are being told they have to work with these tools are being told how this is good for teaching and learning. They're being told it's good because students need to be prepared to use it in their jobs, or it's good because of national notions of competitiveness with other nations. There's a gap here, isn't there?
Um, yeah. I mean, you mean in terms of what we're actually seeing in practice?
Well, there's a rhetorical gap as well as a practice gap, right? It
Yeah.
seems to me that the values that are being enacted in these discussions about what is valuable are not pedagogical ones, and nor are they research-based ones. They're not saying this is going to, well, some of them are saying this will get us better medical cures or something. But it's unclear.
Okay. So I think, yeah, I think that's because, I mean, academic practice is mixed, as you'd expect. It varies between disciplines, it varies between institutions, it varies between even individual academics in the same department. So I think some of those conversations are happening. I think there are some really good, solid scholars out there that are having those deep pedagogical conversations about what it means. But I think it's mixed. And I think it's the same with research as well. Um,
So what
I
is
mean, it's a really complicated picture.
I
And I
mean,
think, go on.
what is changing in academic practice? If we've got this layer sort of above the everyday practice of academia, right? We've got policy,
Yeah.
and we have venture capital, and we have governance of a sort, right?
Yeah.
On the ground, what do you see is actually changing? Because some of the stuff you talked about is not new, right? The idea that people are selling us systems that we then need to have to figure out, those are persistent things in ed
Yeah.
tech. So
Yeah.
what is
Yeah.
different about this one?
I think for me, what's different, first of all, I want to say that the Ref AI work we did, which was purely about research, it showed some really complicated dynamics around this. It's not an easy one. I'll make sure the report goes into the chat, but it was really, really difficult. It raised a lot of questions. For example, one of the things that we do is we write narratives about research as part of that exercise. So we have to write it. And one of the things that I noticed is that um, those research narratives that we might use in the ref, and where we, for example, might use some sort of storytelling about impact or environment or strategy, we see those tools possibly being used for it. And if those tools are used to help draft those narratives, I think one of the things that I see in practice is subtle changes to how language or formulas of presentation start to emerge. A kind of, I mean, I use the phrase algorithmic conformity. Um, and at best that might raise the bar for everyone, but also it might make everything beige. So that the tools are sort of making, I sort of see that the practice where those kinds of algorithmic things are sort of slightly starting to emerge. I mean, there's other things that we're looking at. Researchers are really I found researchers to be really solidly aware of risks around things like hallucination, bias, and provenance when they were looking at these tools and for their own research. Um, but honestly, if I want to, I can't make a blanket statement about academic practice. It's academic practice is changing, but it's uneven and it's informal rather than strategic. And I think the real thing that is different from anything else that I've seen in my time working in education is that this change is the one that is being forced on us most by outside forces. You know, all the other changes that we've seen in academia, they may have been driven by policy, but academics have felt more in control. And that might have been an illusion. But this one is very clearly being driven externally. And it's impacting our academics draft, how they organize, how they present their work. And it's not just in research, it's in all parts of academia. It's also interesting in that I read a quote this morning, and I can't remember where the I think it was a post on LinkedIn, and it said, so even in not using AI, somebody said, in trying not to sound like AI, I stopped sounding like myself. So even if you're not using the tool, you're being impacted by them. So I think that's really hard.
Yeah, so Sarah in the chat is pointing out, people promoting using AI for student grading and feedback, which is sort of the teaching version of writing your ref statement with generative AI. Dara in the Q&A is talking about, this idea of centering humanity. And I know you and I have had long conversations about the risks that are taken, right? If people are leveraging these tools to do things that require historically human judgment, right, and human cognition and human feedback,
Yeah.
what are the risks of shifting away from human judgment to this sort of algorithmically determined decisions without noticing or caring? And something that's coming up a lot in my social media is it's like a 79 memo from IBM. Computers can't be held accountable, so they shouldn't make management decisions. Like, I wonder if you substitute the word teaching or research or, X decisions, what are we doing to the notion of accountability if we integrate these tools into processes that require accountability at some level?
If no one can be held accountable for how a system reached a decision, then we're at risk of building processes where responsibility becomes diluted at best. And even arguing about the outcomes becomes, very, very difficult. For me, the danger is that we stop noticing where judgment has been replaced by some form of system optimization. That 1979 slide from IBM is still true. We have to be mindful. So I don't have a direct answer for the question. I just know that my fear is that it's happening by degrees. And I think we need to be mindful and we need to keep looking at where that judgment is happening.
But there's a whole bunch of churn around whether people are adopting these things too fast or too slow. You spend more time on LinkedIn than I do. And part of the reason that I spend less time than I used to on LinkedIn, which admittedly wasn't a whole lot, is that I got very, very tired of we're doing this too fast or we're doing this too slow. And that doesn't seem to be the right framing for it. Like, at some point, who cares how long this takes? Like, who's giving us this timeline? Who's saying, were we given a deadline and we're fixing to not meet it? Like, I don't know what's happening there.
I understand what you're saying. First of all, I spend time on LinkedIn because I think it's where all the interesting conversations that were happening on Twitter went when what happened to Twitter happened to Twitter. So it's a really useful source of finding out what's going on in institutions and around the sector. So just to defend my use of LinkedIn in that way, I think people are posting it in the same way. The question about too fast or too slow is actually, I think it's the wrong question. The pace doesn't matter. It's not about that. I think what we have to go back is and look at, are we adopting these things without understanding? That's the real question. Too fast or too slow, and all of that discourse around we've got to speed up or slow down is irrelevant. What we really need to do is to think more clearly about what we're adopting and why.
What are we adopting when we integrate GAI tools into our processes? What is the what here? Do you have a credible source for what the what is?
I've seen and documented in their FAI report, which I'll point to again, we saw some really useful practice in the use of these tools for some things in the sector. And I mean, we could start listing things, but I'm not going to do that. I want to sort of keep it generic, but we do see some things that help. We do see, for example, in teaching and learning, that there are some accessibility benefits that have been documented and used. I could see some of these tools being really helpful for some aspects of how academics are managing their time and doing their job. But I think it's more important that we do these things deliberately and with intention. And I think looking at what we do, understanding why we're doing it before we do it is the most important thing. I think there are good things that are happening with these tools, but we need to be intentional.
So you said the phrase saves time.
I did.
That I hear a lot. I'm going to use this tool because it's going to save me time. They don't always say, I'm going to use this tool for X, right? So if somebody were to say, I use this tool to write my students letters of recommendation, I would have additional questions other than time saving. But
yeah,
in your experience, when you talk to people who are using these tools and think they're using time, is that what's actually happening?
I don't think I used the phrase saves time.
When you encounter the saves time narrative.
Oh, when I hear that narrative, well, when I hear the narrative, I kind of have a wry smile, because I'm not sure what we're saving time for. It's not like I can bank it, right? If I saved time during one part of, so for example, if I worked for Garode, and I was using these tools in the background, and Garode could see me getting through a whole lot more work quicker, he would not turn around to me and say, Lawrie, why don't you take Friday off? You've worked really hard. These tools have saved you enough time for you to have Friday off. That's just not the way it works, is it?
Okay.
When we save time using, or when people say, oh, we're saving time, what they really mean is we can do more. And so the narrative isn't about saving time. It's actually just about how am I going to get more work piled on?
You can have Friday off, Lawrie.
I'm going to hold you to that.
Well, okay, but I'm thinking about an individual saying, oh, I use GAI to do XYZ analysis, or or coding is a question that's come up on the social media that I frequent, right? I'm saving so much time using the Claude tool for coding. And then you dig further down and they'll say, oh, but I spent X time correcting the code. So
and again, so what we do is we see activity shift. You know, you see how if you're doing something here. So, for example, one of my colleagues has written some really good stuff using these tools, but they then go back and they check in more depth. So there's a shifting of the activities and the nature of what you do. I don't like the framing of AI saves time. I don't think people should talk about those things. I think what they should think about is how practice is shifting if I'm using these tools, and what are the extra things that I have to do. And that's not a conversation I hear very often.
Well, and what is the difference between someone who has already acquired an area of expertise saying, I can use this to help me draft a thing, and then I am capable of checking because I am an expert in my field, versus an undergraduate student who,
Okay,
they do
so
have areas of expertise. It's probably not whatever their classes are in right now,
I mean,
generate stuff with these tools and not being capable of checking. Like the idea that we're all going to be editors now presumes that we acquired knowledge.
yeah, I
These,
mean,
it used to be,
there's a whole relationship between ideas and notions of expertise now across disciplines that we really need to focus on. And I think uh, inevitably there's going to be some blurring around what that means. Notions of novice or expert and mastery of a subject is changing. We already see, I mean, we've seen some of the tools launched that will do the courses for you. I mean, admittedly, the one that was launched, I think it was Einstein AI. It might have only been in the world for 48 hours, but it forced us to have a lot of conversations. And I think it's things like that. The interesting thing for me, and I think one of the things that academics especially should reflect on, is that when we use these tools, students and academics, if they're using them, they're often drawing from the same underlying models trained on existing academic work. And I don't understand fully what that means to the idea of academic and student. I think that's worth understanding a little bit more. But the underlying tool and the underlying data that it was trained on is from the same thing. And we need to think really clearly about that. And I think that then helps us to understand more about the role of an academic and the role of a student. It's possible that in the future, and from the direction that we're seeing, it's possible that both groups become reliant on systems that produce fluent, plausible stuff, and gradually we'll see intellectual labor move away from deep disciplinary knowledge towards the ability to prompt and curate marine machine output.
that sounds like
And in that world, expert,
Lawrie, you're doing the thing
yeah,
that the guys do, where when you say, how is it useful now? And they
yeah.
say, oh, in 5 years' time, we'll be able to do this and that and this and that. And
Well,
so
I mean,
it,
this is why it's important.
evidence. So you're talking about, you've done your project on what people are doing now,
Yeah,
and you're talking about the problem of expertise and who really even is an expert. We already had a conversation about what are we risking by
yeah.
substituting these tools for human judgment. What is the risk of somebody wanting the feel of being an expert without having any actual expertise? Because
It's look,
expertise allows us to do concrete things.
the risk is high. The risk is high, and it's really important. And Shane's just said Google AI is really bad. I saw a thing today where Google AI, when somebody Googled haggis, it actually gave them a complete breakdown about where the haggis live in the Highlands and what they look like and everything else. And it wasn't doing it ironically, apparently. So, yeah,
Okay,
there's
it
risk.
can't because
But
it's not a person.
yeah, but okay. What I'm saying to people is I'm not saying that I'm going to this state. What I'm saying is that we need to have conversations about what if it goes in that direction so that we can understand more about what it means to be an academic now. So I'm framing a future where I see a direction and trying to get people to think back about an important conversation about what they do now.
So I think being clear-eyed about what academia is for,
Yes,
probably
absolutely.
a good idea, right?
Yeah,
Because if we want to effectively evaluate
yeah.
what these tools could do, we need to have a very grounded sense of what we think we're doing now. And I
Well,
think that
so
we're
the approach,
possibly
the-
less grounded than we used to be in
yeah.
what we think the point of academia is, because of forces outside of academia telling us what they think it's for or not
Yeah.
for.
I think that's really good. I think you're right. I mean, this is really about, we're thinking about the approaches that higher education is taking towards these tools now, right? And what, what does it mean? What is it for? I think what worries me is that the sector bounces between hype and compliance rather than understanding. And that's understanding not just about the tools, but also about ourselves. In some places, we see it, for example, being framed as inevitable. We see it being framed as transformational. Um, and in other places, we see, these tools being framed as a misconduct problem. But all of those conversations miss some of the deeper questions that we should be asking ourselves. And effectively, I mean, the thing that I really keep coming back to is we're allowing these tools, which have been developed outside of the academy, to quietly reshape academic work without examining what that does to our expertise and to our judgment and our own scholarly practice. So the risk is that the adoption becomes normalized long before the sector has decided what parts of academic work should remain fundamentally human.
So, okay, because it's 10:38 and we want to leave time for questions, I want to.
Yes, ma'am.
So what would responsible use, and again, thinking about the people you've talked to, the work that you've done around research frameworks, but also the work that we did looking at staff practices, what would responsible use actually look like in practice? And what sorts of rules about generative AI in particular should be for the sector? And the anthropologist wants to know, who should decide these rules? Who are the people that need to be involved in the process of imagining and then instantiating rules?
Okay. Can it be me?
I mean,
So
I thought you wanted to retire at some point.
So the thing about the doing the ref AI work, which I loved, and we interviewed everybody from pro vice chancellors of research all the way, right down to practitioners. I don't mean that in a down way, but you know what I mean. That whole sort of that flow. And we also interviewed lots of professional services that support research as well. When we said about responsible use and what it would look like, two things came through really strongly. They were transparent use and clear accountability. That was clear. And then when we sort of dug a little bit deeper down, then we got lots of things about human judgment being at the core and in charge of any consequential decisions about teaching, learning, assessment, and what we were doing, research. So human judgment. Everybody was saying that. Everybody came through. I think the reality is that policies, and I'm not saying this about Ireland or what's going on in any particular institution. I'm sort of talking from my own experience of where I've been and from what I've seen in the HCA policies. They look really sensible. But policies that I've seen that have been less helpful, they need to focus less on tools. Don't focus on you can only use this tool. Don't focus on it must be this one and it can't be that one. It's got to be on principles. What are the principles of our use of these tools? Where's the provenance? Where's the disclosure? Where's the academic integrity? How can we challenge automated outputs? What's the process for that? Those are the important things. And those rules, they can't be written by technology companies or imposed by institutional services. They need to be shaped collectively by the wider academy who understand the roles that they're in. And it wouldn't hurt for us to include the student voice in that, as well as academics, as well as professional staff. I mean, TEL teams are perfectly poised to sort of be experts in this field. And they're a great, they're a nexus of both students and staff coming together. So those are the sorts of people I'd like to see involved in those conversations. And, you bring them together, with the HEA, for example, people with a stake in the future of scholarship in higher education and the digital infrastructure of education. Those are the people that should be looking at these tools and saying, this is what we should be doing.
Okay, that seems like a really great note to end on there, and you've given me a nice bit of a pull quote around tell teams as well. Uh, so we're going to bring this bit to an end for the sake of the recording, and in case I don't get a chance later on, I'm just going to say thank you both so much for the conversation. We certainly, or you certainly, covered a lot of ground. I have the sense that you could have kept on going. And there is the sense that we've only just got started, really. But listen, Lawrie, the thought and care you've given the subject really comes across, as does all of the research work and the conversations you've had up and down the country there with educators and leaders and others. And I think that has made this a really valuable and wide-ranging conversation, as has the great relationship between the two of you as well. It's clear you've worked together for quite a while. So we're going to say goodbye to those watching the recording at this point, and we're going to continue.